Welcome to the debate. Let's begin with something incredibly mundane. Imagine you are biting into a fresh, crisp apple.
Okay.
Your experience of that exact moment feels entirely unified, right? You hear the sharp crunch as your teeth break the skin, you feel the physical resistance of the fruit, and you taste that sudden burst of sweetness.
While seeing the bright red curve of the apple in your hand.
Exactly. In your conscious mind, there is absolutely no separation between these inputs. It is simply one coherent, seamless event, eating an apple.
Right.
We take this unified reality completely for granted. But underneath that feeling lies one of the most profound and hotly debated mysteries in cognitive neuroscience.
It really is a mystery. Because, well, when you look closely at the raw biological hardware of the brain, that apple is being violently ripped apart into entirely separate data streams.
Yeah, literally dismantled.
Right. The visual cortex at the back of your brain is processing the color and the shape. The auditory cortex is analyzing the frequency of the crunch, and, the somatosensory cortex is dealing with the physical texture.
While the gustatory system handles the sugar content.
Exactly. Your brain is taking in distinct, physically isolated signals that travel down completely different neural pathways. So the fundamental question becomes, how do we ever arrive at that singular, unified experience of the apple?
And that question brings us to the core of our discussion today. We are examining the baseline architecture of human perception. The central divide is this. Is the human mind intrinsically supermodal?
Meaning, does it operate on abstract, unified representations that naturally blend across sensory boundaries?
Precisely. Or, on the other hand, is the brain stubbornly modality-specific? Does it rely on segregated, isolated sensory channels that are constantly competing for limited cognitive resources?
The scientific literature on cross-modal perception, spatial mapping, and memory offers compelling evidence on both sides. It makes this such a rich area for analysis. And what we find often challenges our most basic assumptions about reality.
Absolutely. I will be arguing that the brain relies on a deeply interconnected, supermodal cognitive architecture. It is fundamentally designed to seamlessly integrate disparate sensory inputs into higher-level shared abstractions.
And I will be taking the contrasting view. I will argue that perception is inherently modality-specific. It is built on isolated sensory modules that do not seamlessly blend, but rather compete for dominance in a highly fragmented, intensely competitive system.
Let me outline my perspective first, and I think we can stay right there with the apple. We often think of our senses as isolated lanes on a highway, but the boundaries between them are remarkably fluid.
Fluid how, exactly?
Well, they constantly bleed into one another to construct our reality. A perfect example of this is a phenomenon known as sonic seasoning. It's the way sound fundamentally alters our perception of taste and texture.
Oh, right. The cross-modal culinary research?
Yes. When you hear the high-pitched snap of the apple, it actually helps your brain judge that the fruit is fresh and crunchy. And it goes further. Higher musical notes can actually make food taste sweeter.
Right. And lower pitches do the opposite.
Exactly. If we pipe in low-frequency bass sounds, people consistently rate their food as tasting more bitter. Even loud background noise, like an airplane engine, dulls sweet and salty tastes while making umami taste stronger. Or think about fizzy drinks. The hissing sound of the bubbles literally raises how fizzy a drink feels in your mouth.
It is a fascinating cross-wiring.
And it isn't just an illusion, This is cross-modal perception at work. If we want to understand the true architecture of the brain, we should look at structural conditions that reveal this underlying connectivity.
You mean like synesthesia?
Yes, take synesthesia. We usually think of grapheme color synesthesia, where people see numbers as colors. But consider lexical gustatory synesthesia. It's an incredibly rare condition where hearing a specific word automatically triggers a real physical taste in the mouth.
A fascinating condition, certainly, but incredibly rare.
Rare, yes, but highly revealing. Research by Edward Hubbard in 2007 demonstrates that synesthetic experiences are driven by what he calls hyperbinding.
Mediated by the parietal cortex, right?
Exactly. My argument is that this is not just a bizarre miswiring. It is an exaggerated, visible version of the cross-modal binding that happens in every single one of us, all the time. We see this universal connectivity in the snark effect.
The spatial numerical association of response codes.
Right. The research shows that all humans inextricably link numerical magnitudes to physical space. We inherently map small numbers to the left and large numbers to the right, even when the numbers are completely irrelevant to the task we're doing.
True, the spatial mapping is very robust.
And the fact that numbers, spatial awareness, and visual mapping are so deeply entwined proves that the brain natively operates in an abstracted, supermodal workspace. Space, number, and sensory input are naturally entangled.
I completely understand why that integrated view is appealing. It aligns beautifully with our intuition of how the world feels. But I have to say, it severely misreads the actual mechanical architecture of the brain.
How so?
Well, the sensory networks are inherently segregated and heavily localized. You bring up synesthesia and specifically Hubbard's 2007 work to suggest this is the baseline for all of us. But if we look at the data, the literature explicitly describes synesthesia as an anomalous activation.
I mean, yes, it's anomalous, but
It is, by definitional biology, an exception. You cannot use a deviation in the wiring to prove the rule for standard neural architecture.
I would argue anomalies often illuminate the underlying rule.
Only if they represent the system functioning as designed, rather than a breakdown of the boundaries. What you perceive as an effortless, harmonious integration is actually a fierce system of sensory competition and dominance.
Sensory competition.
Yes, consider the concept of visual capture. When our senses receive conflicting information, they do not hold hands and democratically blend into a shared abstraction. Vision aggressively and forcefully overwrites the other senses.
You're talking about the Prism glasses experiments.
Exactly. There is a classic study by Hay, Pick, and Ikeda where participants wear special prism glasses. These glasses visually shift the location of everything they see, including their own hands.
Right. The classic conflict between sight and touch.
When you wear these glasses, your eyes tell you your hand is 6 inches to the right of where your proprioceptive system, your internal sense of your body, tells you it is. And what happens?
The brain resolves the conflict.
But it doesn't meet in the middle. You will literally feel your hand exactly where the glasses tell you it is, entirely overriding your own internal bodily knowledge. We experience this every time we go to the movies with the ventriloquist effect.
Sure, the voices seem to come from the screen.
Exactly. The voices seem to be coming from the actor's lips, even though the physical speakers are mounted on the walls all around you. Your visual system overrides the auditory location data. That is not a unified abstraction. It is brute force sensory dominance by our highest bandwidth sense.
Look, I see why you frame it as a hostile takeover, but let me give you a different perspective. Consider what happens when the system is actually working in tandem, rather than being subjected to artificial lab tricks.
I wouldn't call the ventriloquist effect a lab trick.
But strapping distorting prisms to someone's face definitely is. You are pointing to edge cases of extreme, manufactured conflict to define the everyday rule. When we look at natural multisensory interactions, the senses cooperate beautifully to structure our reality.
Do they, though?
They do. Let's look at how the brain parses time. Ann Kosom's 2012 research on audio-visual sensory selection gives us a brilliant window into this. She used a dynamic visual search task.
Okay, remind me of the setup.
Imagine looking at a screen filled with a chaotic, moving crowd of shapes, and you have to spot one very specific target among the noise.
Essentially, a highly controlled game of Where's Waldo, but everything is in motion.
Right. And what Kosom found was that when auditory cues, just simple beeps, were synchronized with the visual target's movements, the participants' visual search efficiency skyrocketed.
Because the sound draws attention?
It's deeper than that. The rhythm of the sound naturally builds temporal expectations that prime the visual cortex to process information better. Now, the mechanism here is crucial. This facilitation only happens at specific temporal rates, specifically below 1.4 hertz.
Right.
But it proves that the auditory system is actively assisting the visual system to predict when an event will occur. This isn't dominance. Think of perception like an orchestra guided by a single conductor, which, in this case, is time and space.
An orchestra?
Yes. The visual cortex and the auditory cortex are completely different instruments, sure, but a shared tempo binds them together into a single supramodal symphony.
I come at it from a different way. I respectfully reject the symphony analogy entirely.
Why? It fits the data perfectly.
Because even in Kosem's study, you see the inherent friction between these systems. When she desynchronized the auditory cues, throwing the timing off slightly, the sound consistently impaired the visual search. It made people worse at the task.
Well, yes, the timing was wrong.
But that points right back to interference between distinct isolated channels. If it were a truly shared workspace, the brain would recognize the sound as irrelevant and filter it out. Instead, the channels crash into each other.
I don't see that as a crash. The interference happens precisely because they are operating in a shared temporal workspace. We see this temporal binding clearly in Virginie van Wassenhove's 2008 work on subjective time perception.
The looming disk study?
Exactly. She showed participants a visually looming disk, a shape that appears to be flying directly toward their face on a screen. When that visual was paired with a sound, the visual feature of looming systematically distorted the perceived duration of the auditory event.
Right. They thought the sound lasted longer.
Yes. The participants literally heard the sound as lasting longer than it actually did. The cognitive perception of auditory time was stretched by visual depth. This happens because the brain isn't strictly isolating these inputs. It's evaluating the intrinsic features of the event across modalities to build a single reality. The orchestra's playing one song.
It implies a harmonious, equal participation that simply doesn't exist in the biology. If we look closely at Van Wassenhove's findings, you see the exact hostile takeover I was talking about.
Hostile takeover? Vision and hearing were working together.
No, vision dictated the terms. Yes, visual inputs easily altered the perception of auditory duration, but the reverse was not true. The perceived duration of visual events was seldom distorted by auditory information, and it was never shortened by it. Vision runs the show.
It's just heavily weighted, that's all.
Let's return to the Prism glasses, because the way the brain resolves that conflict reveals its true modality-specific architecture. After a period of wearing those glasses, if you take them off, your non-visual modality has been fundamentally forced to structurally recalibrate.
Right, the proprioceptive adaptation.
The proprioceptive system literally rewrites its own internal spatial map to appease the visual system. If we were dealing with a true supramodal abstraction, a shared, democratic workspace, the system would find a spatial average. Instead, vision wields veto power over the other senses. That is, strict modality dominance.
But doesn't that dominance only emerge because vision is typically our most reliable sense for spatial resolution? The brain is a highly efficient prediction machine. It weights inputs based on reliability, which is essentially a Bayesian computation.
Meaning it calculates probabilities based on past experience?
Precisely. Think of the brain as a detective trying to solve a case. The detective receives testimony from multiple witnesses, the eyes, the ears, the hands. Because vision has historically provided the most accurate spatial data, the detective gives the visual witness the most weight.
Which proves my point about dominance.
Now, here is the critical point. That Bayesian weighting process inherently requires a supramodal workspace. You cannot compare the reliability of visual data against proprioceptive data unless they are translated into a common language. You can't weigh pounds against gallons without a conversion rate.
I see what you're saying, but...
And we see this common language brilliantly in synesthesia. You dismissed it earlier as a biological fluke, but let's look at Manuela Piazza's 2006 study of a patient with number-form synesthesia.
Okay.
This individual reported a highly vivid, conscious sense of space when processing numbers. They saw numbers physically arranged in a curvilinear, right-to-left oriented line in their mind's eye.
Which is a completely idiosyncratic, highly abnormal mapping.
Consciously abnormal, yes. But here is the remarkable part. When researchers tested this patient on implicit tasks, they found that this unique, conscious, right-to-left mapping coexisted perfectly with the standard unconscious SNARC effect, the left-to-right spatial mapping we all inherently share.
Meaning they had both mappings running simultaneously?
Exactly. The fact that this patient's brain could simultaneously maintain a highly personalized number form and the universal spatial numerical association proves that the brain naturally layers abstract, spatial, and sensory concepts.
I'm not sure it proves layering in the way you mean.
It shows the parietal circuits responsible for attending to external space and the internal circuits representing abstract numbers are deeply evolutionarily linked. The brain doesn't just tolerate cross-modal overlap, it relies on it. It is fundamentally designed to abstract and integrate.
That is a compelling narrative, but let me tell you why I think it fundamentally misinterprets the data. You are equating the feeling of integration with the reality of our neural architecture.
You think the integration is just a feeling?
I think our sense of a vast, unified, seamlessly layered conscious experience is actually a neurological trick. It's an illusion. Cognitive scientists often refer to this as the refrigerator light illusion of consciousness.
Okay, explain how that applies here.
Imagine a person who believes the light inside their refrigerator is always on. Why do they believe this? Because every single time they open the door to check, the light is shining.
Right. But the act of opening the door is what flips the switch.
Exactly. The light is off when they aren't looking. Human consciousness operates the exact same way. When you bite into that apple we discussed at the beginning, you feel like you are fully and simultaneously conscious of the taste, the crunch, the texture, and the color all in the exact same millisecond.
And I am.
But rigorous neurophysiological studies demonstrate that this is impossible. Our working memory is incredibly bottlenecked. We use techniques involving Gabor patches, which are highly controlled, striped visual patterns flashed on a screen for incredibly brief durations.
Sometimes just 17 milliseconds, far too fast for conscious processing.
Yes, and these studies show that our working memory can actually only hold a few tiny, modality-specific scraps of data at any one time. The moment you check to see if you can hear the crunch of the apple, your internal attention swings rapidly over to the auditory cortex, instantly lighting it up in your consciousness.
So you are arguing that the unified experience of reality is essentially an illusion fostered by the rapid switching of attention between completely isolated silos?
Precisely. The information isn't residing in some grand, modal feeder of the mind where everything mixes together. It lives in modality-specific silos. We are only ever conscious of a few specific bits of data at a time, but the incredible speed and ease with which attention pulls from these distinct sensory modules tricks us into believing in a supramodal workspace.
That is a fascinating interpretation, but I feel like it completely ignores the mechanical, functional requirements of memory.
How so?
Let's shift our focus from immediate real-time perception to how these sensory inputs are actually stored and utilized in working memory once that millisecond vanishes. If the refrigerator light illusion is entirely true and everything is permanently locked in modality-specific silos, how do we ever compare two things that are separated by time or space?
What do you mean?
Let's use a very practical example from the literature. Checking a pie baking in the oven.
Right, the classic problem of comparing the physical pie to a picture in the cookbook.
Exactly. You look at the real pie in the oven. Your visual cortex encodes perceptual information about the browning of the crust or how the filling is bubbling. Then, you have to withdraw your attention, physically turn your head away from the oven, look down at a cookbook, and compare your stored memory of the hot pie to the flat visual photograph on the page.
Right.
To execute this perceptual comparison, working memory must utilize an amodal or, at the very least, a cross-modally accessible workspace. You are comparing stored, synthesized perceptual data against real-time visual input.
But that's still visual to visual.
Sure, but if memory were entirely locked into modality-specific hardware without a higher-level abstraction, complex, multiple-object scene analysis would be mechanically impossible. We need a shared desktop to open all these different files.
I agree that we need a way to compare the files, but have you considered the hard, verifiable limitations of memory translation when we actually force the brain to cross between different senses?
You're referring to cross-modal translation costs?
Yes. Your pie example is visual to visual. Let's look at what happens when the brain is forced to translate memory across entirely different sensory modalities. The 2005 study by Newell and colleagues is a prime counterexample to your shared desktop theory.
The tabletop array study.
Yes. They had participants learn a tabletop-sized array of objects. Think of a bunch of distinct items scattered on a desk. Half the participants learned the spatial layout visually by simply looking at it. The other half learned the layout haptically by touching the objects and feeling their positions while blindfolded.
And then they tested their ability to detect changes in that layout?
Yes, but the brilliant part of the methodology is that they mixed and matched the learning and testing conditions. Some people learned by touch and were tested by touch, but others learned by touch and were then tested visually, or vice versa.
Right. Crossing the modalities.
If memory were truly supermodal and abstracted, if it all just went into a general, unified spatial map in the mind, there would be zero cost to switching senses. Imagine you are fumbling for your car keys in the dark. You learn their shape by touch.
Okay.
If you flip the light on, you should be able to visually recognize those keys instantly, because the abstract spatial geometry is supposedly identical. But that is absolutely not what the Newell study found. Participants suffered a significant drop in accuracy when the testing modality didn't match the learning modality.
There was a translation cost.
A hard, measurable cross-modal translation cost, meaning they were significantly worse at detecting a change in the layout if they had to switch from touch to vision, compared to staying within the same sense.
I acknowledge that.
This proves that spatial representations remain stubbornly anchored to the specific sensory hardware they were learned on. The modality-specific representations handled the memory perfectly well when the senses matched, but the moment the brain had to cross over, the cognitive friction caused a steep drop in performance. If a supramodal architecture existed, there wouldn't be any friction.
A file saved on the shared desktop should open seamlessly.
Exactly, regardless of what program created it. The friction proves that memory is stored in the sensory module that originally acquired it.
I concede that the cross-modal translation cost demonstrated in the Newell study is a very real phenomenon. It clearly shows that the original sensory format leaves a lingering imprint, a sort of modality-specific residue on the memory trace.
Right.
However, I think you are overlooking the most remarkable implication of that very finding. The participants could still successfully perform cross-modal change detection. Their accuracy dropped, yes, there was friction, but the task was not impossible. They didn't fail.
But the mere existence of the cost implies a translation process between two separate systems, not a shared universal language.
I would argue that the ability to translate it all implies a higher-level, shared reference frame bridging those modalities. Think about the mechanics of it. How can the visual system possibly understand haptic, touch-based spatial data unless there's an underlying abstract spatial geometry that both systems can inherently access?
They force a translation.
But the friction in translation doesn't disprove the supermodal architecture. It just shows that uploading sensory-specific data to that amodal workspace requires cognitive effort. The fact that a person can feel the complex shape of an object in the dark and then successfully pick that exact shape out of a visual lineup in a brightly lit room proves that the brain possesses a mechanism to abstract physical contours entirely away from the specific sensory receptors in the fingers or the retinas.
It proves they can translate the data, yes, but it doesn't prove that data lives in a unified space. It brings us right back to visual capture. The brain is taking the tactile data from the fingers and desperately trying to build a visual model of it, because vision is our dominant spatial currency.
But that shared currency is exactly what a supermodal representation is a common format. And we see this common format continually reinforced by phenomena like parietal hyperbinding.
The anomaly again.
It's the underlying architecture. When we zoom out and look at the big picture of human cognition, the deep associations in the snark effect, the ability of visual timing to systematically alter auditory perception, and the undeniable existence of cross-modal linking and synesthesia all point to a brain fundamentally designed to abstract and integrate.
I just don't see it as an integrated design.
The parietal cortex serves as a central hub where space, number, and sensory inputs converge, breaking down those rigid sensory silos to give us a cohesive understanding of reality. I maintain that the architecture of the human mind is inherently supramodal.
And I maintain that looking closely at the actual performance costs tells a fundamentally different story. The persistent friction of cross-modal translation, the brute force dominance of visual capture over our other senses, and the fragmented, fleeting, refrigerator-light nature of our conscious working memory prove that our cognition is built on highly specialized, competing modules.
Competing, not cooperating.
Exactly. What feels to us like a seamless, effortless abstraction is actually just a remarkably efficient but entirely segregated system of rapid attention switching and sensory dominance. We are biological machines, frantically patching together disparate, isolated inputs, not ethereal minds operating in a state of perfect harmony.
Well, we have unpacked a tremendous amount of research today, and while we clearly disagree on the fundamental baseline of how cognitive architecture is organized, I think there is a profound area of convergence in everything we've discussed.
Oh, definitely.
Whether it operates through true supermodal abstraction or through rapid, high-friction translation between isolated modules, both of our perspectives ultimately acknowledge that the brain is remarkably adept at navigating sensory overlaps.
I certainly agree with that. The human brain's ability to resolve conflicting sensory information, whether it achieves that by harmonizing the data or by aggressively forcing one sense to recalibrate to another, is an incredible mechanical feat.
It really highlights the immense value of studying both the extreme anomalies, like lexical gustatory synesthesia, and the incredibly mundane illusions, like the ventriloquist effect or the feeling of a unified conscious moment.
They all give us unique, probing windows into the hidden complexity of the human mind.
Exactly. There is clearly far more nuance to explore in the cognitive sciences regarding how we construct our daily reality.
Indeed. The empirical data forces us to constantly reevaluate how much we can actually trust our own conscious experience of the world.
So the next time you take a bite of that apple and you experience the perfect, unified harmony of the loud crunch, the burst of sweetness, and the bright red skin, ask yourself, are you experiencing a beautifully orchestrated, supermodal symphony of the mind? Or is your brain just frantically turning on the refrigerator light fast enough to fool you?
It is absolutely a question worth chewing on.
Thank you for joining us, and we leave it to you, the listener, to decide which model of the human brain you find more compelling.